The Philadelphia Eagles marched into Jerry World and walked all over the Dallas Cowboys. It wasn't much of a surprise, but the offense did struggle early before getting into a groove while the defense continued to dominate. Welcome to the Philly Film Room Podcast. We have another victory pod and another game where the Eagles did what they needed to do so that they could rest their starters late in the game for an upcoming showdown with the Commanders. So what did the Eagles do to come out victorious over the Cowboys, and what can we take out of this game going forward? Let's first start with this offense. And this offense continued its slow starts in the first quarter yet again. They did score a touchdown in the first, but it was mainly a result of the defense forcing a turnover. And these slow starts will become an issue against good teams. This defense has been good and has allowed them to get off to these slow starts, but this defense won't be this good every single game, especially against teams like the Commanders and the Ravens and some of the other teams that we have coming up. And I know a lot of people think the issue is about running in the first quarter and running more in the first quarter. And that very well may be the issue. But at the end of the day, they're 24th in yards per carry on first quarter rushes and 23rd in yards per play on passing plays. So this offense just needs to be better overall running and passing earlier in the game. Ultimately, they did get it figured out in the second half. And really from the 2-minute warning on is when they started to get rolling. But let's look at what happened in specific. Number one, there was a number of breakdowns in pass protection from the offensive line to the running backs. It really didn't matter. Mekhi Becton got exposed a little bit in space in pass pro. Cam Jurgens didn't play well. We saw Gainwell whiff on a block. Saquon Barkley missed a block or two as well. It just was not a good day overall from the protection standpoint. The pressure packages were an issue, and we kind of talked about this coming into the game, that Mike Zimmer is really good with his exotic fronts and pressures that he does send, and it was an issue for the Eagles for much of the game, especially in the first and second quarter. The Eagles allowed 5 sacks, which was third highest in Week 10, and they had the highest pressure rate allowed as well, according to Next Gen Stats. I predict we're going to see more fronts where we see guys walked up to the line of scrimmage. Number one, it forces running backs to stay in protection oftentimes, and we saw Saquon Barkley with his lowest route run percentage of all of his pass snaps this week. I kind of wanted to give out a Saquon Barkley under on his reception total. When you watch this team on film, when we were watching the Cowboys on film, you would see a lot of times that running backs were having to be forced in to stay into block. I just could not find a place to find in one spot where I could see which teams had the lowest percentage of routes run from running backs. But I'm going to be looking for teams playing the Cowboys to take some of their unders on the reception totals going forward. But anyway, back to the point. It forced running backs to stay in to protect. It confuses the offensive line when you walk up all those guys to the line of scrimmage. And oftentimes it makes Jalen uncomfortable. You see his eyes drop and he starts to panic a little bit. He's trying to look for an escape route. And it's been an issue really for this team for a good portion of the year and going back to last year as well. So I do predict we're going to see teams, especially when they get the Eagles to longer down and distance situations, we start to see an increase in frequency of teams walking guys up to the line of scrimmage. But that'll be something to pay attention. And oftentimes that is very dependent on the defense that you're facing. Now, some other issues that happened early in the game. There were a couple of penalties mixed in there. I didn't like a couple of their pass concepts that they use, particularly against cover one. There was still a number that I did like. But again, part of the issue with that too is when you have to keep in a running back to block, or sometimes they're keeping in a tight end as well, you're taking guys out of the route. It makes it easier to cover on the back end when there's less guys running routes. In addition to that, Jalen didn't really have a good game or good process early on. I know some people are saying the sun might be an issue, and it might have been an issue on some plays. For me, it's some of the issues that we saw were just issues that we've seen in the past. So I attribute it much more to that. And also when you look at how they got rolling during the 2-minute warning, Jalen was throwing directly into that sun at that point in time. The issues that I saw on film didn't appear to me to be more of the sun getting in his eyes as it was just him reverting back to some of the stuff that he has done in the past, where he was dropping his eyes, not sticking to the play designs or taking routes that were available, scrambling a little bit too much. There was a number of times where he got to the top of his drop and he's not even in a position to throw. He gets to the top of his drop and he's squared up looking to scramble right away. So a few of those things I think were issues early on, but he did much better with that as the game went on. We just need to make sure that, or we want to hope to see that they are getting some of these issues corrected much earlier in the game. So let's talk about some of his plays that he made. I thought the interception that he threw in the end zone was the right read, right? He's It's a single high defense. They're running a four verts concept. You're reading the safety to start with. The safety's on one hash, so he goes to the opposite side of the field. And really what he's reading is the corner on that side of the field. The corner has his hips and shoulders turned outside, so he's throwing off of the corner's body language and his leverage, and Jalen makes the right read, but he's just a tad late getting there. When you see him from the end zone angle, I think there's just a bit of a pause and a delay in getting the ball out. He gets to a point where he kind of gets to a standstill and has to reload his legs to be able to throw. It's really just that split second of getting to the top of the drop and being ready to throw versus then having to reload and engage your lower body to then throw. That I thought was a difference on that play. So a little bit better footwork and timing, I think, gets it done. I will add into that, I think they could have done a little bit better job of trying to force a horizontal stretch on the corner, maybe using some type of motion with the tight end to get him outside much more quickly. I think that play design could have been tweaked a little bit to make life easier for Jalen. But at the end of the day, it was a great play by the defender. Sometimes you got to, shake the defender's hand and say, good job, you made a great play as well. Trayvon Diggs is a Pro Bowl level corner, and he gets his hands on the ball. So it's not all that surprising to see a guy make a play like that. I think in hindsight, it's probably a better idea to flip the concept and probably try and attack the other corner. When we look at one of the sacks that Jalen took, particularly the sack fumble, the sack was not really his fault, but the fumble was. He needed to have better ball security there, so I will definitely put that one on him to hold on to the ball. But I will say this. I texted my buddy about this during the game. It has to be somewhat difficult to coach Jalen, and not to say that he's uncoachable. It's just that there is the Jalen Hurts playing style that ends up where you turn down open routes, but then you extend and create bigger plays. And we've talked about this. We touched on it much more during the Falcons game. This, especially early in this game, you saw that start to come up. And I think a great example of this is his play to A.J. Brown, where he scrambled and hit A.J. Brown for a 30-yard gain. There were several options in the structure of the play, including what was probably a big play to Goddard down the sideline, but still there were other options coming open underneath. Jalen ends up scrambling, didn't stick to the play design, and he ends up finding AJ late, but that's got to be a tough thing for a coach to say, let's stick to the game plan, but there's so many plays that he's made by extending and creating with his legs. So finding that, walking that line of not trying to corral the creativity and the explosive playmaking that Jalen can create, while also trying to keep this offense on track, especially early in the games when they have been starting slow. So I think that plays a great example of the dichotomy of Jalen Hurts' playing style. And when we look at Jalen, he has the longest time to throw in the NFL this season. That's never really been the case in the Kellen Moore offense. They utilize a lot of quick game in Dallas with Dak Prescott. But listen, at a certain point in time, you got to understand that certain players have certain playing styles. We always sit here and compare Jalen to these other quarterbacks that are playing like this and playing like that. We just got to understand the type of player that Jalen is and understand that we don't need to sit here and try and turn him into Kirk Cousins, because you're going to take away some of the stuff that he does best. Are there things he can improve upon? Sure, absolutely. But he also makes great plays, like the play we saw, the touchdown to Dallas Goedert, where the defense has the perfect play call. They called the perfect play call, perfect blitz, based on what the pass protection was. There was an unblocked defender in Jalen Hurts' face. He makes that unblocked defender miss. He steps up, rolls out, and finds Dallas Goedert for a touchdown. Right? Those are plays that you don't get with a number of other quarterbacks. So it's that fine line you got to walk between being creative and sticking to the game plan. But you see the examples of Jalen being able to make big plays. So sometimes you live by the sword, sometimes you die by the sword. Now, looking at when this game really started to turn around, it was around the 2-minute warning. They started attacking Kalen Carson relentlessly. And we talked about it in the pregame show. He was the mark on their defense. He was the guy that was being attacked constantly, and it showed in his numbers. It showed on the film, and it showed on the numbers. He had one of the highest yards per cover snap allowed, meaning he's giving up a lot of yards, and he's being targeted a lot, right? So during the 2-minute warning, they essentially just kept going after Kalen Carson over and over and over again. And it kept up after half until the Cowboys decided to bench him because he just kept getting smoked. So I don't know why they didn't go with this game plan earlier in the game. They did have a number of plays designed and drawn up to attack Trayvon Diggs. And Trayvon had, for sure, one holding penalty. There might have been another one. And I do think Trayvon is a guy that you can attack in coverage. But when you have a guy that is so much worse on the other side, I think they probably should have been going at him a little bit earlier in the game. Now, looking at this run game, they did struggle early on, partly due to bad blocking. We touched on in the pregame show how one of the things I would try and do is attack DeMarvion Overshown, running downhill at him. And the Eagles did that on the very first play of the game, but I'm pretty sure he knew it was coming. The entire Eagles offensive line was pointing at him. And so when the ball was snapped, he immediately attacked downhill and he dipped right under Becton. They didn't come back to that later in the game. I think they probably could have. It was more so an issue of execution. And it's something that we've seen in the past with Becton being a little bit slow coming off of his combo blocks. And then with his height as well, it does make it a little bit more difficult for some of these smaller, quicker guys to dip under his punch. But if you can coach that up on the sideline, I still thought there was a huge opportunity to come back and really take advantage of that matchup because other teams have been taking advantage of that. I don't think they needed to go away from that just because it didn't work on the first play of the game. But in addition to that, they also struggled when they weren't attacking Overshown directly. When they were trying to run plays and put him on the backside of concepts, they were struggling to get cutoff blocks on him as well. The Cowboys did a good job overall of using line movement to disrupt the blocking scheme, and they were often able to pin offensive linemen trying to climb to the second level or just straight up get into the backfield due to poor technique. There was a play in particular with Cam Jurgens where the Cowboys are running a slant back in the opposite direction of where Cam Jurgens is moving, and Cam lets the defender across his face way too easily. And that's been an issue kind of with Cam Jurgens for a good portion of his career. Oftentimes, he is a little bit too eager to get out of his stance. He is very fast off the ball, but that does allow defenders to cross his face pretty quickly. That's something that will need to be cleaned up in his technique issues. The Eagles are going to see a lot of similar stuff against the Commanders. Dan Quinn will use a lot of stunts and a lot of line movements. So it was good to see that in this game because they're going to need to be prepared for it going up against the Commanders on Thursday. Now, they came out in the second half with more of an emphasis on gap scheme runs and allowed them to get downhill and have much better success. The Cowboys' second-level defenders had trouble figuring out the run fits with pulling linemen, and then you add in motion as well, and they struggled with that too. And then they kept that same energy going and added that to their quarterback bash concepts to build off of their gap scheme runs. It resulted in a 9-yard gain to Saquon Barkley hitting the edge, and then it also resulted in a touchdown by Jalen Hurts later in the game. They probably could have stayed, like I said, they probably could have stayed a little bit more committed to the run a little bit earlier. They were kind of pass happy in the first half. So hopefully, going into next week, if they're not having success on the ground game right away, don't just go away from it. Kind of stick to it and figure things out. Now, I will say the Cowboys were trying to commit to stopping the run. They were coming out in some of those 6-1 fronts that we've seen from the Eagles in the past. The Cowboys did this against the Falcons as well. The Falcons still ran all over them, so I don't think they needed to necessarily get away from that stuff. But overall, the team and Jalen played better in the second half, and they got better as the game went on, but they must get better early on, and they can't continue to get into catch-up mode, especially if they're playing good teams. But moving on to the defense is really what stood out in this game. They had a great day overall that continues a string of dominant performances. It was the fourth game that they haven't allowed a touchdown this year, and one of the field goals they did give up was gifted to the Cowboys due to a turnover. They only allowed 146 yards, and it's the second time holding a team under 150 yards in a game. They had 5 turnovers, and they're now up to 13th in turnovers per game after starting the year with 2 in their first 6 games. Yes, it was Cooper Rush at quarterback, but he did have over 100 yards in the fourth quarter alone against the Falcons last week. And at the end of the day, dominant defenses need to be dominant against bad teams, and that's what the Eagles did. Now, there's some more big tests coming up, but when you look at what Joe Burrow and the Bengals did to the Ravens and both matchups with them and how they played against the Eagles, I mean, at some point in time, we have to start believing that this is a legitimate defense. Now, let's touch on some of the things I like scheme-wise. I like their third and short strategy that we saw come up a couple of times during the game. They would get into man coverage, then they would line up a number of players on the line of scrimmage, which forced the running back to stay into block. So now the defender that was likely covering the running back in man coverage would just drop out and play as an extra essentially hook defender. And what that allowed the defense to do, especially with CeeDee Lamb in the slot, it allows your slot defender to play much more aggressively with his outside leverage, knowing that he has a lot of help underneath and inside. So I did like that strategy on third and short. I did think they had a good use of creeper and sim pressures this week, which helped force the Cowboys to not always slide to Jalen Carter's side. We talked about it in this game or coming into the game, how the Cowboys would slide away from Tyler Smith because of how good he has been. And Zach Martin has been having a rough year to start this year. So I thought, especially, I don't know if this was why they did it, but the first play of the game, they sent a pressure from the field from Tyler Smith's side. So I think, to me, it might have been an indication of, hey, we're going to send pressure from this side of the field. So you're not going to just sit here and be able to slide away from Tyler Smith all game and help out Zach Martin. Now, they did a number of times throughout the game, but you saw a number of instances where they were forced to change up their protections a little bit. And I liked how Fangio was using different fronts to force one-on-one blocking from the offensive line up front as well. We also got to see them defend some quarterback run game stuff with Trey Lance, which is going to be important going into the next few weeks as they're playing Jaden Daniels and Lamar Jackson, and then they're going to be playing Jaden Daniels again later in the season. So it was good to see them face a mobile quarterback like Trey Lance, and they did a good job containing him on the design quarterback run stuff. Now, I did think it was interesting, not necessarily something that I liked scheme or game plan wise. They had Milton Williams playing a good amount of early downs in the first half. I think that's probably likely due to the fact that the Cowboys have had one of the highest pass rates in the NFL coming into the game. So I think they were predicting that the Cowboys were going to be passing a little bit more. And JD has really been the guy that's playing primarily on early downs. No matter the package, whether it's base or nickel, it's been primarily Jordan Davis that has been the early down run defender, especially when the games are still close. So I thought that was interesting, and it really showed in the first half that the Cowboys were having a good amount of success, especially compared to what we have been seeing from this Eagles defense. The Cowboys were having a fair amount of success on the ground in the first half. Once they switched to Jordan Davis in the second half, playing more of the early down snaps, it's just clear that he is a much better run defender than Milton Williams and Moro Ojomo. The guys can handle and take on double teams much easier. He compresses gaps. He will literally just take guys and compress them and push them into gaps and play his gap with his body in the gap and then close off the other gap with the offensive lineman's body, because they just can't handle when Jordan Davis just sticks his hand into their chest. I imagine he's going to play a lot versus the Commanders, a lot more, especially early against the Commanders, as the Commanders are fifth in run rate this season. You really have to take away the Commanders on the ground before you do anything else. So I think we're going to see Jordan Davis play a lot more in that Commanders game. Now, moving on to some of the players in the game and some things I really liked. We got to touch on it because we came out last week and there's some concerns that we had really going back the past few weeks. And the very first play of the game was great to see. CJ Gardner-Johnson playing with great eye discipline. It allowed him to find the ball, explode to the ball, and he made a huge hit to set the tone to start the game. And we talked about how it's just been an issue for much of the year. He has been playing with bad eye discipline, constantly getting his eyes back to the quarterback and not figuring out where his man is, just waiting to see if the ball's coming his way before getting to his assignment. The very first play of the game, you saw him not take his eyes off of his man at all, and his eyes brought him to the ball, and he made a big play. He gets that figured out. I think all of his issues, the majority of his issues are going to be taken care of right there. So I thought it was great to see that. He also had an interception later in the game. He did a really good job getting from the hash to outside of the numbers as a post defender. That's excellent to see. He showed really good range on that play, and it was really one of the better games for him overall. So it was good to see CJ bounce back in this game. Jalen Carter had another dominant game as well. He's credited with 4 pressures, but there was a number of times where the ball came out incredibly quick and he won incredibly early. And I thought this was a passing of the torch to the next generation, especially when you saw him working Zach Martin all game long. There was already a passing of the torch from Fletcher Cox to Jalen Carter, and now I thought it's really a passing of the torch from Zach Martin to Tyler Smith being the best offensive guard in the NFL. But back to Carter, he won in multiple different ways, and he was good against the run as well. He had 3 run stops, which, although they're not always tackles for loss or no gain, it constitutes as an unsuccessful play for the offense. So he had 3 run stops there. Zach Bond continues being a force. Although he had a season high in missed tackles, he was always around the ball, and even when he missed tackles, he was often forcing the ball carrier back into the pursuit. So I thought he had a good game still. He had 2 forced fumbles and a fumble recovery. And listen, the turnovers were always going to happen for Zach Bond when you see how often he gets to the ball, how quickly he's flying to the ball, and how physical he is. So the turnovers were going to come with him, and he was also excellent in coverage as well. He allowed 7 yards on 3 targets. All 3 targets were caught underneath, but he's always Johnny on the spot, being right there as soon as they catch the ball. So there's very little room for those receivers to work. Quinyon Mitchell continues to lock down anyone that comes to his side, and I'm extremely grateful to have Quinyon Mitchell on this team, especially after seeing how much Terrion Arnold is struggling to start his NFL career. Again, I think this is just a great takeaway that elite athletes with elite production profiles in college usually translates to the NFL, and you add in that Quinyon Mitchell has that dog mentality. This was a surefire thing for the Eagles. Now, Quinyon being able to lock down his side gives you much more confidence to be able to flood the front side of trips concepts, trips formations, and leave him one-on-one to the backside. So having a guy like Quinyon is awesome for this defense and awesome for Fangio to be able to utilize the rest of the defense. Jalyx Hunt also got to play a lot. I didn't think there was anything spectacular, but he didn't look out of place. He did have a solid bull rush that turned into a tipped pass. I imagine he'll continue getting to see more early down snaps against the run. Bryce Huff got in on the fun with a strip sack as well. His burst off the edge forced the offensive tackle to turn their hips and opened up the inside counter. He also had a nice spin move later in the game to force Trey Lance off of his spot, and it ultimately resulted in a team sack because Trey Lance ran out of bounds for a loss. Not sure if it was part of a stunt. If it was part of a stunt, then I thought it was a good play by Bryce Huff. If it wasn't, he needs to be careful taking the inside counter against mobile quarterbacks like that. But even if it wasn't a stunt, this kind of highlights what I've been talking about for much of the year with ways to get Bryce Huff going. If using ET stunts allows him, which means that the defensive end is penetrating inside first and then the defense tackles looping around for contain. If you set that up and allow Huff to have a situation where you're giving him an inside counter, number one, it will open up things for him to get to the edge because that's really his fastball. He wants to get the edge and get around you. And he has one of the fastest get-offs in the NFL. 0.61 seconds this week was his get-off time. But by running inside counters, it's going to help and force the offensive tackle to honor the inside counter and allow him to get out to the edge. But it then just gives them a path to hit inside counters when they are taking away the edge and taking away the outside, or when they're chipping him as well. So I do think that running more ET stunts with Huff on the field is something that we should see more going forward. Now, I'm not sure if he wasn't playing more due to the wrist injury. The wrist injury definitely will affect you in run defense if there's a good amount of pain. You can get away with it a little bit more as a pass rusher. The thing is, he really hasn't been a bad run defender. There's been a couple of plays you could look at here or there throughout the season where you'd like some plays back, but he really hasn't been a bad run defender for much of the season. He's made several good plays against around the past few weeks where he's gotten to play more on early downs. But again, at the end of the day, Nolan and BG are better run defenders. Hunt has the size and length to be a better run defender than Bryce Huff as well. It's tough for those smaller guys, especially guys with shorter arms, to be good run defenders. You really want length to create separation, to be able to lock out and then shed against the run. But that's something that Huff is going to have to overcome as a run defender throughout his career. I will add into this as well. Oren Burks was the first linebacker off the bench. And I think you feel comfortable if he has to get more playing time. And I think that's important to pay attention to because Dean was listed as a non-participant in Monday's estimation of practice before their early game against the Commanders. And Dean did come out of the game earlier than the rest of the starters did. So this might be a game where we see Oren Burks get some playing time. And as we looked forward to this game against the Commanders, there's going to be a number of injuries that we need to pay attention to. Nakobe Dean being one of them, Darius Slay as well. And you know what? Jordan Mailata might be back this week. The Eagles opened up his 21-day practice window and listed him as a full participant in Monday's estimation of practice. Now, it might be just gamesmanship. We'll see. But I don't know. There is a chance that Mailata might be back. And that will be huge as we go against the Commanders this week. This is going to be one of their biggest tests of the season. And it's going to be huge for the battle of the NFC East, especially when you're trying to make sure you're getting home field advantage throughout the playoffs. So we will be back actually on Wednesday with the preview pod due to the short week. So make sure that you're checking out for that episode. But that'll be it for us today. Make sure to, as always, like, subscribe, and spread the word. Until next time, go Birds.